This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 131, Sex, Part 2. I'm Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for coming back. This is the second part of my conversation with Matt and Jenn Schmidt, the co-hosts of the Intimate Covenant podcast. Find out more about their work at intimatecovenant.com. Check out the first segment if you have not done so already. Here we will discuss lessons in marriage preparation from the Shulamite in the Song of Songs, and what might be gained from teaching some new tricks to old dogs like me. Let's start with what I've been reading. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, has been interpreted any number of ways, but one thing is certain. The Shulamite opens herself to her beloved in a way reserved only for him. As chapter 8 and verses 8 through 10 illustrate, she made herself to be a wall. Then when the time and place were right, she became a door. How can we do the one, and then how can we do the other?
Yeah.
Great question.
This is a good question. I like that you pulled this verse out.
Yeah, I think, referring to, especially if we're referring to sexuality, and I assume that's how we're taking this metaphor as a wall and a door. This is something that is so difficult for Christians, I think, especially those of us that were raised in the church, as it were. And maybe something that's perhaps even more difficult for women, to flip that switch of protecting their sexuality and then transitioning in marriage to being more open with their sexuality.
Right. I think all too often we inadvertently or even, outright are taught that sex is dirty and shameful and scary and dangerous, and you should save that for the one you love. So we get all these negative, and I understand we're trying to protect our young people, and we're coming maybe from a place of understanding the right place for sex, but all too often it's presented in a very negative way. And then the minute that we say I do, you're supposed to switch, and all that negativity should just poof be gone away with. And now it's right and it's beautiful, but our brains don't work that way. And when we have spent our entire early years of forming our sexuality in this negative, silent, shame-filled, environment, you can't just on the day you say I do switch to now this is wonderful and beautiful and I can't wait to share all of me with you.
Right. A holy view of sexuality is not something that you just flip a switch. A holy view of sexuality is something that has to begin even before you get married. And I think in this case, we're calling out parents a little bit here, that parents play a big part, maybe the most important part, in shaping a young person's view of sexuality. And this goes back even to the discussion we already had about the difference between motivating by shame versus motivating by glory. And if we spend all of our time teaching our children that sex is bad and dirty and dangerous, that's not how the Bible paints the picture of sexuality, at least not in its fullness. Yes, sex can be dangerous and it can be shameful when it's used the wrong way, and sex is dirty when it's used inappropriately, but sex in and of itself is not something that's dirty, and dirtiness is not inherent to sexuality. We have to do a better job of teaching our young people the message that sex is beautiful and holy, and that's why it should be protected and preserved, because it is so special that it needs to be preserved and used in the right way.
Right. I mean, we need to be teaching our kids that God created sex, right, and he is the author of sexual desire. And those are beautiful and right and holy things. And, it is our job as parents to help build that wall around our children in helping to protect their sexualities. But that comes from a place of understanding the beauty of what God intended and the holiness and the wonderfulness of sexual relationships shared within marriage.
Satan did not invent sex. And he did not put sexual desire within me. That is something that was created when God made us male and female. God created sex for the purpose of drawing us toward one another and teaching us something about the kind of passion that he seeks us with and that we ought to be seeking him with. Sexuality is something that is quite spiritual, and it's something that is given by God. But I think too often we get the impression, at least, that sex is just something we just have to do, or we do it out of necessity, and God kind of turns his eyes away.
He leaves the bedroom.
But yeah, God leaves the bedroom when we have sex. He just kind of turns a blind eye and lets us do what we need to do, as long as we do it in one particular way. I think that those kinds of misconceptions, even if we're not speaking to that specifically, the silence that we as parents and as a religious culture have towards the topic of sexuality says everything about shame. It's something that we can't mention, we can't talk about, we can't approach. And that kind of silence just piles more shame on the entire topic. And therefore, then our young people are left with learning about sex from their school system or the internet or their friends in the locker rooms and at sleepovers. I mean, what a horrific place to learn about what the true beauty of sex is intended to be.
Well, our culture, I'm old enough, you may not be old enough. I'm old enough to remember a time when our culture helped us build those walls.
Mm-hmm.
There was a significant amount of cultural shame attached to unwed pregnancy,
right?
Even to a certain degree, premarital sex, certainly sex as teenagers. That was obviously, people did it. It happened, and people did it and got away with it sometimes. But there was a significant social stigma that was attached to that kind of thing. You didn't want to do it because you didn't want to get caught. You didn't want to suffer the consequences. And, the pill came along, that put a crack in the wall. Before too long, there's, rampant divorce rates and all kinds of cultural changes that have whittled away at the idea of one man, one woman, one lifetime. And we've lived to see the day where it's just not that big of a deal.
Yeah, and I would suggest, sorry to cut you off.
No.
I would suggest that even the cultural stigma that was present even in those days was even coming from, I think, the wrong place of motivation. That it was socially unacceptable because you didn't want to get caught, as you said, or you didn't want someone else to look down upon you, rather than from the standpoint that it's wrong, or it should be looked down upon because it's not holy, and because sex should be held in a place of honor. And that's why it's not appropriate to do it outside of the marriage bed. And I think society now has reacted against that motivation, that shameful motivation, and now is just freely permissive. Well, that's why we've gotten this pendulum swing in the entirely opposite direction.
There's not a lot of cultural problems that I'm not prepared to lay at the feet of lazy parenting. That covers most of it. And this is a great example of that. It's not that I am using my relationship with God and my participation in spiritual things and my personal Bible study with my children to teach them what sexuality is, what marriage is, and such. I'm essentially letting my culture do it for me. I don't want to get involved in this. It's uncomfortable. It's tiresome. It's embarrassing, quite frankly. There's no telling what these 14-year-olds are going to ask. They don't want to get pregnant. I know they don't want to get pregnant. So we'll just kind of let that go and it'll take care of itself. And by and large, it does in the 50s, 60s, maybe the 70s. And then we get into a situation where those kids are having kids and they're rearing their children the same way that their parents reared them. And culture is still driving the bus, but the bus is not pointing in the same direction that it was before.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
And now all of a sudden they're learning all these negative things and these incorrect notions about what proper behavior is, and society is taking them in a very carnal direction. That's not necessarily, the consequences are worse, obviously, for the one, but it's really the same problem, isn't it? That
I agree. I agree.
we're not taking our responsibility to rear our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord as we should.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
and we're not teaching about sexuality. I mean, the reason we see the culture around us that we do, those are all sexual problems, right? Because that is who we are. And again, going all the way back to, you are made male and female. You are made sexual, and you have sexual desires. And Satan understands the power of that. And so we can look at our culture and see how he is just chipping away at everything that is supposed to be holy and right. And again, we've got to start, it has to start from a place within our homes of teaching our children of the beauty of their sexuality, of the beauty of sexual desire. And quite frankly, that starts by first teaching that to ourselves, right? We have to come to a place ourselves of understanding, what did God have in mind? What is the purpose of married sex? Why do we do what we do? And understanding that is meant to draw us to God. Every physical desire is meant to draw us to God, including sexual desire. That desire for connection with another is meant to show us the way that God passionately desires connection with us. But we want to divorce sexuality and spirituality, and we can't do that. And that all starts within our homes. And quite frankly, I think it also starts not just with us doing a better job of understanding it ourselves, but then doing a better job of communicating that with one another. I mean, it's way easier to share our naked bodies than it is to share a conversation about sexuality with one another. So many married couples cannot even talk about sex. They'll do it with the lights off, but they can't even talk about it because they have cloaked sex with this sense of shame and silence. And you got to be having the conversation within one another, with each other. And then that conversation needs to travel out into the whole rest of your home. I mean, your kids need to know you have a great sex life. And I understand there's a shock value to that. I'm not saying your kids need to know when and where and how, but your kids better know that married sex is great, because that's what God intended. Your children, if you're not talking actively to your children about the beauty of married sex, Satan is telling them that sex is great outside of covenant, that sex is what young, hot, 20-something-year-old bodies do in this whole hookup culture. And that's where the greatness is. That's where the fun is. Married sex is boring and, in fact, gross and awful. That's what your children are hearing. Your voice better be louder than that.
You know, would you say then, talking about walls and doors here, would you say that if we build the walls up properly initially, we help them appreciate what sexuality is, its proper role, why it does not belong in your life right now, at least as we generally define it, that when the time comes for them to become a door, when the time comes for them to open themselves up to somebody, that it would be a considerably more natural response at that point, and to a certain degree even a welcome response. This is what I've been waiting for, not in the conventional, guy drooling on his wedding night kind of way, but in a more wholesome and holistic kind of way. This is what I was meant to do. This is my role in this new family of mine. And there's a way to do it. There's a way to not do it.
No, I 100% agree with you. that if we spend the time and notice, I mean, even in the passage you read in Song of Songs, or you quoted in Song of Songs, that in that chapter 8 in verse 8 and 9 is this bride's brothers talking about the fact that they want to protect her sexuality, they want to help build it, and she confidently then states in chapter 10 that I am a wall. I have built myself into a wall, but I am going to open myself as a door to my beloved.
Mhm.
She had a role in building herself up as a wall. Her family had a role in building herself up as a wall, protecting her, but also informing her. I mean, a tower or a wall, whatever it is, has to be built brick by brick. And that means that her view of sexuality came from a solid place, but it came brick by brick. Some sex educators talk about having 100 1-minute conversations with your children about sex over their lifetime, or 1,000 conversations, rather than the one so-called the talk. If you just,
it's terrifying to you and terrifying to them,
and awkward for everybody.
Everybody holds their breath, and we just get through it, and we think that's sex education. Well,
Yeah.
that's not how you teach your kids about salvation. You don't teach your kids about salvation in one talk. You teach them about salvation and all these beautiful conversations throughout your children's lifetime.
Mhm.
Why wouldn't you be talking about their whole selves in the same way?
Because their view of sexuality and what they need to know and are prepared to know has to change over the course of their maturity. And I think the most repeated refrain in the Song of Songs is "Do not awaken love until it pleases," or until its proper time. And that means that means, number one, that we have to be diligent about keeping sex in the right perspective and in the right place, but it also means that there is a time where it should be awakened. And so if we're not diligent as parents, or as even single people, single adults, young adults, if we're not being diligent about keeping sex in the right place and making sure that we're not stirring up those emotions, then we're not doing our job. I mean, looking at it from, maybe another perspective, I mean, I think we as Christians have put very little thought into how we are preparing our children for relationships. We, from the time sometimes that they're in kindergarten or even younger, we are eagerly encouraging them to pair up with somebody else. At times when they're not emotionally or spiritually prepared to be able to handle that kind of intense relationship, we put them in programs or send them to summer camps or whatever, where the focus, at least on some level, the focus is to try to pair these young kids up. And they're just not simply prepared emotionally or spiritually or even physically to be able to handle that kind of intense connection. We're so eager to put them together, and so then they are also then required then to suffer these intense, unnecessary emotional breakups. They're not prepared for the intense and unnecessary sexual temptations. We're putting our kids in positions of really a lot of unnecessary suffering and temptation that's really not. Maybe we should be delaying that to a great extent.
Right. We've bought into how the world goes about,
because we're doing this the way the world is doing it.
Right.
That relationships are what you should be doing at this age, and you should be getting involved in
at age 12, 14, even 16, when they're nowhere near ready for what is actually required for these relationships. They're not ready to fight those battles yet.
Yeah.
They don't need to be suffering through almost the level of divorce when they're 14 years old. That's just not the way that it ought to be. Right. But I think it goes back to, we just haven't put any thought into how should we be approaching this. We just are doing what we're seeing around us. We think that's the only way. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we should go straight to arranged marriages necessarily, although, the more daughters you have, the more you find that might be not a bad idea.
As the as the father of two, I can sign on with the idea. One of mine has married off and seems to have married well, fine Christian man. We're happy about that. The other one is still in the unmarried state. But as the father of daughters, I look at this passage in Song of Songs, and how she says, "I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers," a defense mechanism, basically. I don't know exactly how literal I'm supposed to take that, but there is a physical presence that naturally separates boys and girls. That just because I am built, or my wife is built as she is, there is a natural separation that's keeping two people apart. There is a safety thing built into that, and I think that's a big part of this bit about being a wall, not just a physical proximity, but an emotional proximity. I will not let you into my life. I will not let you into my mind until we get to a certain point in our relationship. There is a necessary barrier there. And our society, of course, has flipped this on its head, where the sexuality of a person is a door. We're encouraging access. We're encouraging coming and going through this sexual imagery, through body parts and that sort of thing. And God is trying to tell us, I think, like you've been saying from the beginning, this has a place, but it's not every place. And you need to set up walls so you'll know when to open your doors. And when we properly understand sexuality, use that sexuality to keep people at bay, just from a practical standpoint. Obviously there are some cretins out there. There are some men who will do what they will do, and they're bigger and stronger, all things being equal, than the women. We're not talking about that. Generally speaking, boys need permission to get to first base or to second base or whatever. And if the girl doesn't provide that permission, if she holds back, that's an incentive. Well, why don't you behave more like a man? Why don't you get a good job? Why don't you learn how to serve the Lord better? Whatever. Show yourself that you're worthy of getting to first base, that you're worthy of getting to second base, or whatever. If we take that away, if we strip ourselves of the natural defenses that we have there, nobody's improving, nobody's growing, relationships aren't forming. We're trying to avoid relationships, quite frankly. And that's not what God's plan is.
Totally agree. I mean, I think you hit on some important points there. And the sexual desire that a man has is, I think, in part given to him to motivate him towards those other realms of connection. Without that sexual desire, most men would have very little interest in hanging out with girls. There's just not a whole lot interesting about girls except for their sexuality. And so that should be a motivation.
I will give you a chance
person.
to take that comment back, man.
I know what he means by that.
I'm just telling you that is a primary motivator, at least as what introduces that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Boys and girls, before they have the hormones of puberty, don't do much together, and they're awkward together.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the same interests. They don't look for the same things. But
they don't play the same way. They don't interact the same way.
Right.
They're in general they're viewing life and thinking about life in a very different way.
Sure.
Sure.
But when that sexual desire starts kicking in, then they all of a sudden now are drawn towards one another. And again,
and that goes both ways.
Yeah. And there's a right place for that.
But you talk about the tower and the tower, the breast being a tower does create some physical separation. I guess I would look at that even maybe in a slightly different way, that a tower is something that is prominent and proud, that she's built this wall, and on that wall she has towers because she's not afraid of who she is in a sexual way. There's no shame there that's clouding who she is, or she's not trying to hide the fact that she is a woman. That's something that's out there that she is proud of and not ashamed of, but but it's also, those towers are on top of or behind a wall. So they're not accessible to everyone. There's a glimpse of that to everyone, but not everyone's allowed inside the wall. And going back to maybe the original question, is that if you build the right kind of wall, then you can bring your beloved inside that wall. And that wall can still be a place of protection and security, but also a place that you share openly. Once you're behind the wall, then there's nothing held back. There's nothing secret or hidden there.
This is what I've been playing. Fog of Love is a relationship simulator. You and your playing partner assume roles that come with characteristics, talents, preferences, and personalities. Life throws a few curveballs at you. You weather the hardships, enjoy the blessings, and eventually you either fulfill your destiny together or you don't. I would call Fog of Love weird but interesting. Tracy, my wife, would call it just weird. So we're probably done with it. Pushing boundaries is fine in concept, but we have more or less found our lane and we'll stay in it. Thank you very much. I feel safe in saying that most married people my age have settled into a sexual routine. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or is it some of both?
Yeah.
Far be it from me to judge your intimate relationship, but maybe there's some of both, I think, or maybe we could consider the idea that there may be some of both. I hesitate to try to stir things up in situations where folks are happy with their sexual relationship. If everybody's happy, then maybe there's not really a problem there. But I guess I would maybe flip that question from the standpoint of looking at our relationship with God. Is he satisfied with us staying in our lane and settling into routine? And maybe it depends on what we mean by that. If a relationship is not growing, it might be dying. But can you grow while you stay within a narrow set of things that you are doing? And maybe that's true. I mean, we don't have to come to God and worship and do something new and great every single Sunday that we assemble. But if we get into such a routine that it's just rote and there's no real connection happening, then maybe we should reevaluate our worship and see what we can do to shake things up, as it were.
Right. I mean, if we think that we can just coast in any part of our relationship, we're likely to find that we're coasted to a stop. I mean, that is the nature of relationships. You're either growing together or you're pulling farther apart. And all too often, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, all too often we all of a sudden wake up one day and realize we are very far apart from one another. How did that happen? We didn't set out to be at this place in our relationship, but I think we end up coasting to this place.
Yeah, I mean, every aspect of a relationship requires intentional effort to continue that connection. Whether you're talking about our spiritual connection, our emotional connection, or sexual connection, every aspect of that relationship requires intentional effort. So, I mean, if staying in your lane means that or settling into routine means that we have ways that work for us to continue connecting, then I'm all for that. Great, keep doing it. You don't have to do something that you're not comfortable with. I don't think that's not really what we're trying to promote or encourage even. The goal of our sexual relationship ought to be seeking connection with one another. Right. So whatever that looks like in your relationship, then that's what I would say keep doing.
And I would say the only way you know if what you're doing is promoting connection with one another is if you're talking about it.
Right.
And that, I think, is the fundamental place that most marriages could do a much better job of, is talking about our sexual relationship with one another and what is or isn't working. Where are places for growth? I mean, and also recognizing that assuming you've been married for a while, you're not the same person you were when you got married. I mean, that is the truth about, ourselves as human beings, right? We grow and we change. And he's not the 21-year-old guy that I married, and I'm not that young girl that he married. And so there always needs to be this, yes, I know you, but where can I know you more? And yes, I know what you like, but where might that have changed, and where can we grow in discovering more about one another? There should always be an aspect of discovery and mystery within our relationship with one another, especially in our sexuality and shared sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the great benefits of marriage is that it's lifelong. And so that we have this lifetime to continue to get to know each other, to continue to grow, and to continue to experience one another. Home base, or what we settle into, as it were, is great because it's familiar. And if you've been married for longer than a week, you have a sexual routine. There is a home base for you that you settle into. But it's so easy for familiarity to breed complacency or contempt. Even when you settle into something and you take it for granted, that becomes a problem. And again, this is true sexually or emotionally. When we're dating and when we're getting to know each other, we spend a whole lot of emotional energy trying to impress the other person. But it doesn't take long into marriage that the flowers disappear. The love notes don't show up as often as they used to, and we take that for granted. We get into our routine. So is routine good or bad? I mean, I guess it depends on what that routine means. But if we settle into a routine that might be vanilla or boring, but we're still seeking one another, I think I'm certainly all for that. We're not necessarily.
You each get to define vanilla and boring, right?
Well, there's a lot of vanilla fans out there. But yeah, there's a difference between being routine and being thoughtless, mindless.
Agreed.
You can, and that's not just true in a sexual relationship, but just in your relationship in general.
For sure.
I don't know how long we'd been married, 10, 12 years, something like that. And Tracy got it in her head that we needed to be spending more time together. We need to be doing more things together. And I'm like most men, probably after 10 years of marriage, what are you talking about? We do things together.
We live together.
We live together. We watch TV together, and that's one of the reasons why we got into board gaming, actually, just to connect with one another and to connect with our children as well. The idea of deliberately focusing our efforts on something communal, something larger or outside of ourselves. Deliberately choosing to find something different and respond to that is thoughtful. And if the same thing works for you every time, then do the same thing every time. And I suspect, I'm kind of curious exactly how many people in their 50s you counsel along these lines. I suspect that probably would naturally change from your 40s into your 50s into your 60s. For sure. Not necessarily in a bad way, but that what is expected of me as a husband 20 years ago, if I wanted to act like a hero, I'd bring home a bunch of flowers from the grocery store. Now, if I want to be a hero, I bring home peanut butter M&Ms, and I get the same reaction for less money. It's all good. You know what the other one needs in that moment. And
I think,
and that's true.
That's
of course,
excellent.
It's true in a sexual context. Point. It's true in a physical in a broader physical context or emotional context. Hopefully, we grow in our association with one another, where you don't even have to have the conversation necessarily, although it's good to have the conversation. We know each other. We can get a step ahead of this. I know where we're going with this. If I'm wrong, then she can correct me and we can work it out. But I think I know my spouse well enough to know this is the way to present myself. This is what I need to avoid. This is what I need to work on. And that's true in a sexual aspect, I suppose, as much as in any other.
Oh, for
I
sure.
need to be
That's true.
connected. I need to be
Right.
one flesh with my spouse.
Right.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I ever get to a point where I think that I automatically know everything about my spouse and there's no need for me to change gears or change up anything, then I've become like the world, who fails to recognize the beauty of God in every daily moment. I'm like the person who walks outside and sees the sunset and just walks away without even acknowledging the beauty there. That
Mhm.
every sunset is different, just like every day with my spouse is different. And as we grow together, I mean, yes, her needs and her desires have changed over the last 25 years, and so have mine. And we've learned to seek that out, to be interested in that, to desire to try to meet those needs and desires to whatever extent that I can in every realm of our relationship. I mean, sex is supposed to look different when we're older than when we're younger.
Mhm.
It has to. But if we settle into a routine like, well, this is just what we've always done, then I'm not going to be able to meet the new demands that come about, even just with the changes that occur with aging. We're not going to be able to work on that. We'll never be able to improve our sexual relationship. It just becomes routine. This is what we've always done, and I'm too uncomfortable to talk about doing anything else, or too uncomfortable to express that my needs or desires have changed.
Mhm.
Right. And when your goal within your marriage is not just the fleeting pleasure of two bodies, but your goal within your marriage and your goal within your sexual relationship is connection, deep connection with one another, then what you do may change, but yet you can still have that place of of pleasure that comes from connection. And so yeah, your sexual relationship should look different as you age, because there are deeper places to connect with one another as you change. And so again, you can have home base, you can have familiarity, but always be seeking for further discovery of who your spouse is. Don't ever just assume that
Yeah.
and I think that gets back to viewing your spouse as being made in the image of God. Do we recognize the power of that we can be joined with an image bearer? I should be in awe of that constantly. But this is an image bearer of God, and as such, I need to treat this not with just everyday familiarity that is almost disdainful, or but I should treat this with a sense of awe, a sense of excitement. Our relationship with God should always come from a place of, I want to know you better, I want to live in your way better. Your will is becoming my will. And
Right.
that same kind of sense of exploration should be in our marriages as well.
Mhm. One of the concepts that we tried to talk about even at our most recent marriage retreat, that is the idea of trying to sanctify the ordinary moments. And by that we
Yeah.
mean try to see those daily things that we do every day in a more eternal perspective. And I think some of the ways that we do that is through establishing ritual. By that I mean, what are the things that I can do on a regular basis, on a daily basis, that promote connection?
Yeah.
By ritual I mean, like, I don't know, a dumb example that I sometimes use here is, my job, I'm not sure how it ever came to be my job, is to set the coffee pot up at night so that it is ready when Jen wakes up at the crack of dawn or before, that her coffee is ready and it's hot and it's
Right, because
ready
I
for her.
need like coffee 5 steps from my bed, just
Yes.
about. I mean, I want my coffee immediately.
So somehow that became my job. Not sure, and I started to resent that a little bit. That, why is this my job? She's the one that's drinking the coffee first in the morning. She should set it up. But I tried to turn that into, that's when I'm cleaning out the coffee filter and going through all those steps. that's my opportunity to focus on her and to pray for her and pray for what she might need in that moment. And so I've tried to take something that is ordinary and mundane and sometimes even distasteful and try to turn it into a place where I can connect.
Yeah.
And there's so many other places that we have opportunity to do that, but we just let the moments go by without seeing them in a more important light.
Right. Right.
I
And go ahead.
well, I was just thinking about how this is going to air in October, and this is the time of year when the leaves start falling and the temperature starts dropping, and college football fans get all antsy, and everybody says this is my favorite time of year, and I like autumn. I like it a lot, but seems like every time one season yields to another, I go through the same kind of thing. I really love spring. I really love summer. It's not that one's better than the other, but when you are introduced to it after waiting for 9 months, you find joy there. You find peace there. You find a blessing there that you may have forgotten about a little bit.
Right.
And when we're progressing through life like this, it's not about, I wish we were back in our 20s, or I can't wait till we're in our 60s or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about finding purpose and joy where you are and finding God's blessing where you are. And maybe my approach to my spouse or my approach to faith or whatever is going to be different now than it was a few years ago, a few decades ago. That's not good or bad. That's just the way it is.
Right.
And it's a new opportunity to learn. It's a new opportunity to grow. And it's not about finding the best place in life and staying there as long as you possibly can.
Right.
Because you don't really have that option.
That doesn't happen.
That's not life.
It's not the way it works. It's about
Yeah.
finding joy and purpose where you are. And that's whether you're on your first week of marriage or your 50th year, whatever it happens to be. And I believe sex is a big part of that. There is a way to find that satisfaction, that connection in that place where you are.
Mm-hmm.
It may mean a little bit of transition, it may need a bit of practice or work or embarrassment or whatever, but there's a way to grow there. And why wouldn't you want to take that?
Right. I think that's beautifully said. I mean, it is always about growth. I mean, that is the essence of our relationship, is we have this beautiful opportunity on this side of heaven to have this incredibly close relationship. There is no relationship this side of heaven that is as close as a marriage can be. That is why God uses this relationship as a metaphor for what he longs to have with us. And we're meant to see within our marriages that this should be and can be a place for incredible, joy and rest and healing and all of these wonderful, deep emotions that we can have together. But those only come when you're willing to keep growing together and keep recognizing the impact that this marriage is and what it's meant to be, the true purpose.
And be willing to see those everyday moments as opportunities to gain that connection, to fulfill that connection. It doesn't, your marriage is not made up of, annual events. Your marriage is made up of everyday choices. Yes, it's great to have, a celebration together or have some big event together, but we can't live our whole life on a weekend getaway. We have to go through daily life. And when you start to see those daily mundane things as a place for even deeper connection, that's when life really becomes rich.
Right. When you can take routine and turn it instead into sacred places for connection, that really adds to that.
Yeah, and it parallels again with our relationship with God. When I am closest with God is when I am capable of stopping and seeing the beauty in everything around me, or seeing his work in what I'm doing and everything around me, from the least of it to the greatest. And that's when I feel closest to God. That's when I think that he's able to work best in me. That's when his influence shapes my character so much more, when I acknowledge him in all of those individual activities. And again, it just so closely parallels a marriage relationship, I think, on purpose. It parallels a marriage relationship because that's how we set it up. But when I feel closest with my wife is when I can see her and acknowledge her in every little part of what's happening around me. But on top of ritual, the other idea that we introduced was introducing this idea of play. And so I love how with your podcast you introduce this and bring this up, but with all of your episodes is,
well, and I like how you said this was an intentional, the playing together was an intentional thing to bring that deeper connection into your marriage and even into your family.
Sure.
Because play has an important part in our lives.
Oh,
and
I think
and in our
it's such an
marriage.
important part of all relationship. The relationships where you play are your closest relationships, because
Have trust.
play, you have to trust someone to laugh with them. You have to trust someone in order to put down your guard and let them be a part of you in that vulnerable way. It's how you introduce laughter. I mean, we're not board game people necessarily, but we do other things that are still playful, in the sense that, you know, we love to eat fancy food together. We love to hike together and camp together. We love to visit national parks together. So there are plenty of things that we do that just invite that sense of adventure, that sense of joy, that sense of accomplishment. Some people are creative together. They make things or build things or create other things together. Doing that together with your spouse or with your family is what unifies you. There's a sense of unity in ritual. There's a sense of unity in playing together. That's what helps bring us together, and that's what makes the relationship that more special.
Yeah.
It's how we sanctify the ordinary moments.
Absolutely. Well, what has gone unsaid that you need to say?
Wow, that's a big question. You know, Matt always ends every one of our podcasts with the phrase, keep striving, don't settle. And we were just recently talking about, where did that phrase come from? When was the first time that he said that? And we don't actually really remember exactly what prompted him to say that. But I think those two simple little phrases capture so much for us. Because your marriage should be about keep striving, just like our relationship with God. It's about the constant seeking of one another, the desire to be known and to know one another. And, you know, like kind of been the theme of this whole time with you is that idea that within your marriage, you have this beautiful opportunity to know someone deeply. And when you're complacent about, you're not honoring them, you're not honoring your covenant. And so it is a call. Keep striving is a call to keep connecting, keep thinking that there is more to share with one another. Keep that sense of curiosity and mystery with one another, because then that just becomes deeper and deeper, which is exactly what the metaphor of marriage is meant to be all about. And then from that, don't settle in a place of good enough. You know, all too often we compare our marriages to somebody else and we say, I'm better
than those guys. Yeah.
Better than those guys. And so therefore we're good enough. But when you settle in a good enough marriage, you have missed what God has in mind for marriage. So be willing to dig in deeper. Where do I not know my spouse? What are the places that I could do a better job of knowing them? What are the conversations we don't have,
right,
that we should be having, you know? And again, going all the way back to full circle to just our sexuality. Are we really sharing ourselves, our whole selves, with one another?
Yeah.
Or are we just occasionally sharing our bodies? Because God had so much more in mind for sex than just two bodies.
Yeah, at the risk of the risk of sounding like I'm preaching a sermon here, you made me think of the Jacob story. Jacob's one of my favorite characters in the Bible, and the night that he spends wrestling with the angel, when he feels like his whole life is falling apart, and God commends him for this. His hip is dislocated and he won't quit yet. I will not let you go until you bless me. And that's when he becomes the wrestler, Israel, the one who wrestles with God. There is a blessing here, and it does not automatically present itself, but it's there. I know it's there, and I'm going to fight until I can find it. And that would apply to marriage too. And I'm not trying to get overly graphic about the wrestling imagery with regard to men and women, but there is
Matt and I will go there on our podcast.
but there's a fight there, and sometimes we're fighting against our spouse, almost, it seems like. But if we can determine to find that blessing, God's going to help us, and I suspect more often than not our spouse is going to help us too.
Absolutely. We need to wrestle with God. We need to wrestle with our marriage. We need to wrestle with our sexual relationship and really grapple with what that means to us, and what does that mean to our spouse, and what is the significance of this? What's the spiritual implications of our sexual relationship? Those are all things that we do need to wrestle with. And I think if we'll involve God in that wrestling with our marriage and with our sexual relationship, like you said, that is when he can bless us, is when we're willing to confront it, when we're willing to try to deal with it, rather than just trying to tuck it away. Don't talk about it. Don't think about it too much. Try to push it to the side. We cannot be blessed in our sexual relationship and in our marriage if we just try to push it out of the way.
You have been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.